Welcome back, segment 2, Gold and Black Live, March 1st, 2019. Sitting to my right, you all know him, no introduction is needed, for Brian Neubert. Brian's seen a lot of basketball in his day here. I guarantee you nobody does it better, because I was a reader and a fan for years. And I always want to know, what does Brian think? And Brian right now has a great story on the website on two seniors for the Boilermakers, Ryan Klein, Grady Eifert, and again, Saturday, senior day. Here we are, the last game of the year, the last game of the careers for those two guys. Sort of share some of your memories about both those individuals.
Yeah, I think what kind of stands out is, this was a season where, the reasonable expectation after Purdue lost what it lost from last year's 30-win team, given all the productivity and the substance and just the sheer numbers involved with Purdue's senior class last year, this could have been that typical bridge year, that quote-unquote rebuilding year where the program takes a little bit of a step back. And, Purdue's got 3 games left and they're playing for a Big Ten title. I think that you don't do that unless the few returning guys you have, the few older guys you have, provide stability, provide substance, provide a lot of stuff to make this season something much more than it very easily could have been. Both guys obviously came into this season in very different roles than they were used to. This was sort of the outlier story in college basketball nowadays. You have 2 guys who were part of a program for 3 years who had to wait their turn and did. I think they were in different situations in the sense that Ryan Klein was a good player who was behind other really good players. Grady Eifert was simply in the same position, but also he was kind of along for the ride to a certain extent, too, being a Purdue guy who always wanted to be part of Purdue basketball, given his connections to the university. Just a really good, I guess, story in the sense that they both waited their turns. When their turns came, they obviously really, really made something of a season that could have gone a lot of different ways, and because of it, leave an actual legacy to be celebrated, to be honored, to be recognized tomorrow in Mackey Arena.
Yeah, opportunity meets preparation. That's what I always remember about success. And in this day and age, when everybody's so quick to pull up their stakes and want to leave a place when things aren't going their way, it is sort of delightful to see two, I guess, soldiers of the program stick with it and be rewarded with very memorable senior seasons. I mean, Brian, 6-5, you were in Indianapolis coming off the Notre Dame loss. Purdue looked like maybe it could be an NCAA bubble team. Here we are, a couple months later, 3 games left. Brian, Ohio State on Saturday, go to Minnesota next week, finish up at Northwestern. Purdue wins out there, at least guaranteed a share of the Big Ten title. First of all, take us to Saturday. Big news coming out of Columbus today. Tell us how that impacts tomorrow's ball game.
Well, it's actually interesting because anytime a team suspends its best player the day before you play them, typically that's awesome news. That's like the best case scenario because it obviously limits your opponent considerably, him being the player you play through, him being your best player, him being your most imposing physical matchup. But Purdue played this very team it'll see tomorrow in Columbus a couple of weeks ago because they got Caleb Wesson in debilitating foul trouble. He was barely a factor. And
6 points.
Correct. And when he was out of the game, Ohio State went small and played really well small, made a lot of threes against bigger Purdue lineups. Andre Wesson, Caleb's brother, was really good, sort of playing as that undersized 5, so to speak. So the dynamics of this game completely changed. The good news for Purdue is that, A, a very good player is out of commission for this game, but also Purdue has frame of reference on what they're going to see tomorrow because they've already seen it and they've already beaten it. If Ohio State shoots the way Ohio State has had a weird penchant for shooting against Purdue the last 2 seasons by guys who aren't known as shooters, Ohio State can hang in. But I think that as good as Purdue's been at home, as limited as Ohio State should be from an ability perspective, but also a depth perspective, from a matchups perspective on the interior, obviously this is a very significant development.
It's crazy to think, isn't it? If Purdue wins Saturday, it will go unbeaten at home for only the 3rd time in the history of Mackey Arena. That still just blows me away to think of all the great teams Purdue's had and this would only be the third unbeaten season in Mackey. Yeah, again, back to Ohio State real quick, Brian, coming off a big 20-point win at home against Iowa, and they had a freshman come out of nowhere and score 20 points. So they could be formidable still. But
Yeah.
I guess I'm eager to know, and I'm sure a lot of listeners are eager to know, of the 3 games left, which one scares you the most from a Purdue perspective?
Well, I was thinking not to take Ohio State lightly. I think things change now without Caleb Wesson. I think that severely limits them. I've always thought going to Minnesota is going to be a one to not be taken lightly as well. I think Minnesota is very capable. Remember, that's the same Minnesota team that was up by 13 points with 14 minutes to go in the second half in Mackey Arena, where Purdue's not lost a game this year. They have players. Amir Coffey showed everybody last night how good he is. Jordan Murphy is one of the best rebounders the Big Ten has seen in a long time. And they have the ability to really cause problems for people. They play better at home than they do on the road, probably. And I don't think you ever take them lightly when you're playing them there. That being said, Purdue's going to have a lot at stake. One would think that Purdue brings its most maximum urgency level, whatever it may be. But even if you do, Minnesota is capable of playing at a level at home where that might be a challenge to match it. I've always thought, regardless of what the circumstances were, regardless of what was at stake for Purdue this season, that game at Minnesota was going to be one that was going to be a real landmine. After that, I don't think you can lose to Northwestern. I think Northwestern is the worst team in the Big Ten by a long shot. They can't score, and I would just be very surprised if Purdue had much difficulty there. But I think the Minnesota game really kind of looms as the game that's standing between Purdue and a Big Ten championship.
It's crazy to see where Northwestern's fallen since being a national darling, just 2 or 3 years ago with their first ever NCAA bid. Now they're in the basement of the Big Ten.
Right.
One other thing I'll bring up with you, too, Brian, is the sense of urgency for both Ohio State and Minnesota. Purdue's in the big dance. They have urgency, of course, to win the Big Ten, but Minnesota and Ohio State are desperate teams.
Right.
They're probably on the bubble right now,
Correct.
safe to say. So they're going to get, Purdue's going to get their best shot from the Buckeyes and the Gophers, because both of them know, hey, we knock off a Big Ten front-runner ranked,
Right.
top 10, 15. That's obviously going to augment your resume. So that's another red flag of danger for Purdue when they wade in against the Buckeyes and the Gophers.
I think Minnesota's probably in a position here where they can lose to Purdue and still make the tournament. Ohio State, I don't know. Haven't studied their prospectus quite as closely, but I think I think Minnesota could be in that position against Purdue, where if they win, they're in. And it being that late in the season, I would expect Purdue to see a pretty urgently motivated Minnesota team. And that's been a program that's been kind of inconsistent. So you've never necessarily always known what you were going to get from Minnesota. If they have any competitiveness about them, any awareness of the moment, I would think that game against Purdue on their home floor would be one that they're pretty dialed in for.
So what you read, fans are getting a little antsy up there with Richard Pitino. So yeah, I think he knows what's at stake, and he knows the sense of urgency, obviously. Brian, we talked about Ryan Klein. We talked about Grady Eifert. They are seniors. This is, in fact, the last time they'll ever run out onto the Mackey Arena court. But I got to ask about Carson Edwards. I just would like your perspective. I think fans would like to hear it, too. He's a junior. We all are very familiar with his resume. We all are very familiar with his wants and desires professionally. Do you think this is maybe the last time fans will see Edwards in Mackey Arena?
I think it's certainly possible. I think it is very possible. I think a lot's going to go into it when the time comes. But obviously he went through the NBA process last year. There's a lot of questions you have to answer when that time comes. What does another year do for you from a stock perspective? You have to make a business decision here. You can't decide, I'm having too much fun to leave. Now, I mean, you obviously could, but if you want to make the best decision for your NBA considerations, you have to go when the iron's hot, and you have to ask yourself some hard questions, like, what can I get out of coming back another year? Mm-hmm. Can that hurt me more than it helps me? what does this year's draft look like? How can I improve? How would I improve if I came back? What are the team dynamics? What sort of games am I going to play in? What sort of situations can I be in that can really help me? Whether it's fair or not, the deck is stacked nowadays against guys who come back repeatedly because it makes NBA people ask questions of why couldn't they, or why didn't they leave earlier? And it just gives them more time to kind of pick your game apart. Over time, it's human nature to look at weaknesses over strengths in time. And when a guy has given you that much opportunity to look at your weaknesses, when the first thing you notice is the strengths, that can hurt you. I do think that, Carson Edwards probably went through the process last year looking at it like, I'm going to do this now and then I'm going to go next year. Sometimes when we have an expectation in our mind, it's hard to move off that expectation when you've been planning toward that expectation. I think, this season has been a success for him in the sense Purdue's winning. I think there's been some inconsistency. I think some things have come to light in terms of, well, he's probably never going to change into something he wasn't before as a player. So a lot of that stuff has to come to the forefront when the time comes. The time is not now. The time will be later. But I would probably think he gives a really long, hard look at going now, while the draft is what it is, while his stock is probably in about as stable a position as it's probably going to be.
Yeah,
that's my guess anyway.
Sure, yeah, that's all we can ask for. I think some mock drafts, I'm sure some of you out there click on those just to kind of get an idea maybe where Edwards is projected. I think mid to late first round, second round at the very least, right?
I think he's probably got 1 foot in the end of the first round,
Okay.
1 foot in the start of the second right now. Obviously, the workouts will go a long way toward either enhancing his stock or even hurting it. You don't know how that's going to go either way. He will work out well because he is a guy who nobody's going to question his work ethic in terms of improving as a player. He is a workout guy. He is someone who is always in a gym within reason, working on his game, working on his individual skills. When you see him as a scorer, you see the little nuances like his footwork, like his hand placement, like his readiness to shoot, the way he uses screens sometimes. You see that this is a guy who has put countless hours into the minutia of becoming a scorer in basketball. And because of that, he will go to a lot of these workouts, the individual stuff. He will do well. He will measure well. He will do the athletic testing very well. The things he won't do so well are things he's not changing because he's not growing. He's not going to go from 6 foot to 6'3" in a month. He is not going to necessarily change as a player. I think right now he is sort of that change of pace scorer off the bench in the NBA where you bring him in as part of your second unit against somebody else's second unit and you just ask him to go up and down the floor, change the pace of the game, just go get buckets for 5 minutes. That's probably what he's best suited to do. I think from a projection standpoint, the thought of him growing into that traditional point guard, I think that ship has probably sailed. I think I am speaking from some measure of understanding there. I think that's what the NBA people are probably seeing. That is good work. I mean, there's no shame in being that guy. That is a great living if you can get it. That being said, that is also a very competitive marketplace. That is a very flooded market. There are lots of talented guys out there who can run up and down the floor and score. A lot of guys who you don't even know about in college because guys with that sort of talent sometimes can't thrive in structure, can't find their niche, and they don't do anything in college. He's obviously a very accomplished college player, so he has that going for him versus the field.
Yeah.
So I do think he has a leg up on those guys. But for a lot of guys in the position he's in, from a draft perspective situation, it might not be a straight line to the NBA. It is very possible he might have to take the path less traveled to the NBA. I think he's probably realistic enough, self-aware enough as a player to know that's possible. And that's a big part of these decisions too. If a player understands he might have to do the G League, he might have to do a two-way contract, maybe even go overseas for a year, and they're willing to do that, I think they're much more likely to go because they understand exactly what they're getting into. And that's the most important part of this. What are you willing to accept? What are you willing to do to get to where you want to go?
Lastly, Brian, I've got to know, Michigan State, 3 games left at Indiana. They come home, finish with Nebraska and Michigan. You think the Spartans win out Or what is their most difficult challenge of those 3 games in your mind?
I still think Michigan is so good that you don't take them lightly, even when you're playing them at home. I think that's going to be an emotional day for Michigan State. I think Michigan State maybe is playing over its head a little bit too, in the sense that they're missing a couple of really important pieces. And sometimes you get by on sheer adrenaline when you lose a guy, you know?
Nick
and
Ward.
Eventually, people start scouting you for what you are. People start preparing you for what you are. Your depth takes a toll. And it is very possible that the Michigan you saw in Game 1 without Nick Ward and Josh Langford, who they've been playing all year without. Matt McQuaid's got an ankle now. Obviously, Kyle Ahrens has been playing through some things for a couple weeks now. That stuff can catch up with you. And the Michigan State that Michigan saw in Ann Arbor might be a very different Michigan State than the one they end up seeing in East Lansing. They might be a lot easier to prepare for. They might be a little bit worn down. They might be more vulnerable later, even on their home floor, than they were right away on their home floor, on Michigan's home floor. I can't even speak.
And you know, Michigan would delight in nothing better than being able to rain on Michigan State's potential Big Ten parade and take away at least a share for the Spartans. So a lot of good points there, Brian. Hey, of course, go to the website. Brian, again, has that great story on the 2 seniors for Purdue up. I'm sure soon you'll have a preview, maybe it's up already, of the Ohio State game. Always very comprehensive. So again, you guys know where to go to get prepped for Saturday. And again, always appreciate your time and your expertise, Brian. When we come back for segment 3, the final segment, I guess maybe we saved the best for last, right? The former Oakland Raider, former Purdue All-American safety, Stuart Schweigert, will join us for segment 3. So hang around.